This podcast is aimed at mature audiences. It may contain content that is graphic, disturbing, or traumatic for some. Please check the show notes for episode-specific content warnings.
Welcome to Season 1, Episode 3 of Emerging Aotearoa. I'm Knicki, your host for this episode. Today we journey to a post-apocalyptic world and follow Sarah as she navigates this twisted domain. Written by J.C. Hart, the author of The Deadway from Episode 1. Let us begin.
Hope Lies North by J.C. Hart. Sarah pressed her palm against the hand carved into the pahudakawa. The bark was rough beneath her skin, but that roughness was a comfort in these days when the land shifted almost constantly and the trees were the only things to remain unbroken. The index finger of the carved hand was elongated and pointed the way, leading her ever north. She'd seen the signs a few days ago, noticed their increasing frequency, and though she didn't know what they meant, she had hope. Hope, it was a fragile thing, but something she clung to now that the earth had revolted, intent on tossing the humans off its back, ridding itself of the vermin who had treated it so roughly. Sarah couldn't blame it, her, Papatuanuku. She'd started talking to the goddess, not always kind words, but with no one else to talk to, it didn't really matter. The earth might be out to get her, but Sarah knew it wasn't personal. And she was fairly confident that Papatuanuku wasn't listening to her anyway. She tried her best as she moved, to show the earth that she loved it. Hell, she'd been such an environmentalist just weeks ago, before everything changed. But there was no indication it made a difference. Tension filled the air and Sarah cocked her head, trying to figure out where the change was coming from this time. It didn't matter. So much didn't matter. She unhooked the rope from her waist and slung it around the trunk of a tree, quickly tying off the knots and shoving the clawed toes of her boots into the bark. Her feet had just left the ground as the change hit. Wind whipped through her short black hair and she closed her eyes, though she could imagine how it looked. Imagine the sickening tide of land masses shifting. She could hear the groan of stone and roots, could feel the tree tilt sideways, could smell dirt in the air, dirt and water and swamp. Oh gods, she clamped her teeth, swallowed her scream of fear, and then it was still. She hung there for 10 minutes, maybe more, just to be really sure. And then she pulled her claws from the trunk, her feet swinging in mid-air as she dangled down the side of the new hill.
Shit.
Trying to swing them back up, catch the claws in the trunk again, do something. The ground wasn't far below her, but the weight of her body on the knots had made them tight.
Shit.
She let out a scream then, feral and twisted, like the landscape around her, and then she grabbed her knife from her belt and sliced through the rope, her last rope. The ground was littered with stones, small and round and hard, and she slid down the hill and into the fetid swamp at the bottom, the smell embracing her, the mud spattering up her arms and oozing between her fingers. She tried not to cry, tried to hold on to that hope she'd felt before when she had seen the hand. If she could just pick herself up, find the trees again, find the hands, follow the trail, it had to lead somewhere. She took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, tried to remember those guided meditations she'd used to do, but none of them really applied to this situation.
Breathe in, but not too deeply, lest you swallow a bug. Though, perhaps that might not be too bad. You haven't had a decent meal in weeks. And exhale slowly, letting the tension release from your body as you do.
No release of tension. She had to get up. Now. The mud sucked at her hands and feet as she pried herself free, and it took all her strength not to just stay there, wallowing. She stumbled to the base of the hill, the rocks digging into her knees, but feeling at least a little more solid. She lay back, staring at the full, round, midday sun, letting it dry the mud on her skin and clothes, sink some heat into her body. It had taken her hours to find the next hand, but once she had found it, she picked up the trail fast, and on the fourth tree, bearing a print, she found the words, "The Grounded," and she whispered them to herself, a monotonous mantra.
The grounded, the grounded, the grounded.
Could they be the ones she'd heard stories about? The ones who were attuned to the earth, safe from death and destruction? Tangata whenua, that's what she needed. That was what she had searched for. She quickened her pace, eyes picking out the handprints in the failing light, until she found one that wasn't a print, but an actual hand, nailed to the tree, its index finger pointing the way. Sarah stopped, for the first time uncertain. She wanted to reach out, to touch the hand, to see she was just imagining it. But there was a ring on a finger, and creases on the skin, worn and weathered, but not rotting, not yet anyway. She leaned towards it, inhaled that sickly sweet smell, telling her that this was the real thing. She pulled away, stomping her feet in the chilling night air, nerves ticking over in her belly. A stick cracked behind her, and she twirled. Before her stood a cowled man, his back hunched, burdened with a heavy pack. "You wish to become grounded?" he asked, his voice raspy.
What does that mean? Are you the people who are safe? Tangata whenua?
People of the land? No, we are more than that. We are the conquerors, the ones who stand even when the earth wishes to shake us free. He tossed his hood back, revealing a pale face, eyes stark and blue in the light of the full moon. He had lost an ear, the skin around the hole was seared as though it had been burned. "And you've come to join us?" This was what she wanted, right? She wanted to be safe, to know that she could stand tall without the constant fear of being killed. And yet, at what cost did it come? A hand, or something more? Still, it might be worth it.
I am curious. Can you show me what it means to be grounded?
Come. He nodded once and turned his hood up, shuffling away from her and into the woods. The land seemed to solidify under their feet as they walked, or so it seemed to Sarah. He moved with a confidence she hadn't seen in a long time. Despite his bent back and his hidden face, she missed that comfort, that unquestioned security. They emerged from the woods into a very small town. A whole town, only the edges frayed and torn by the earth. Once they stepped over the cracked chunks of pavement and road, the concrete was flat, smooth, broken only by houses and businesses. There were no lights, though the full moon afforded enough visibility, and there, in the middle of the only street, were others, gathered around a bonfire. The man walked to the nearest building and shucked off his pack, standing taller than expected once he'd relieved himself of his burden. "I am Oak. Come." He beckoned her towards the flames, which seemed to drive the chill away even from here. Sarah hurried behind him, not wishing to leave the side of someone who was at least a little familiar in this group of strangers. "Brothers and sisters, we have a new arrival. Come to find the grounded, to become one of us." Oak spread his arms wide, like the tree he was named after.
Hi. My name is...
"No. Your old name isn't something we need to know. Here, you become something new. You give up everything that you were."
How?
She asked, shaking her head as she looked around.
How is this here? How are you here?
She felt a niggle in her throat. Wasn't sure if she wanted to cry or vomit, or just fall into a heap and never get up. It was too strange, too difficult to comprehend. She barely knew who she was now anyway. The only thing that defined her was her survival. In order to become more, she didn't want to give up her name, but it seemed so meaningless, if that was all that stood between her and this shifting earth. It was only then that she had noticed the details of those who had come around her. They were missing limbs, ears, noses, the occasional eye.
What happened to you?
We became something new. His voice was intense, his stance as well. Then he relaxed and smiled, though it seemed forced. "Sorry, we haven't had a new recruit in a long time. I forget what it felt like to come in. We must look like something out of a horror film? But I assure you, we're good people, and we're alive. You want to live, don't you?" Oak held a hand out, and her fingers twitched, itched to take it, to believe what he was saying. It had been so long since she'd felt like part of something. "You can trust us." He nodded, then spread his hand to the side to indicate the rest of the group. "We were all lost once, and now we gather to reclaim what was ours, what the earth has taken away from us." Sarah cocked her head, had to still it from her disagreement. The earth was never theirs, not really.
But how? She's showing us that she won't lie still. How can we make her?
Might as well ask how to beat a god into submission. It was just the same. "We probe deep inside her. We're going to kill her. We've got bombs." His grin this time was sincere, feverish, but the words stopped her heart. It was madness, not just madness, but it wouldn't work. People had been mining deep, tunneling into the earth for hundreds of years, and it hadn't killed the earth yet. Sarah looked at those around her, saw the same gleam in their eyes. They believed Oak. They believed they could do this. Arrogance. But how the hell was she going to make it out of here? She would rather take her chances with Papatuanuku than this lot.
What does it take to become one of the grounded? Is there a task, an initiation?
Oh, there is, of course. We need to be sure you're dedicated. We don't have the resources to keep those who aren't. He flicked his hand back to her, and this time she took it with no hesitation. What was that old saying? Keep your friends close and your enemies closer? Sarah shook the wooden bars of the makeshift cage. They'd tied her foot to the back of it with thin wire, and though she had been working on chewing through it for hours, she was still tethered. So this was how they treated their new recruits. She should have known it was too good to be true, should have stayed alone. Outside, she could hear them talking around the fire, debating what she should lose, what they should call her. "An eye? I don't like the way she looked at me. It should be an eye. No, I think we should take her lips so she can't speak when I... God, you're so crude. Is that all you think about? It's not like we get many women in here. Gotta repopulate the world, right?" And on it went, on and on, until she wished they would take her ears so she didn't have to hear it anymore. She had to get out. Sarah retreated to the back of the cage, taking the wire into her mouth again, chewing like a rat, red-eyed and afraid, red-eyed and menacing. It had finally started to give, thinning and then breaking, the sharp end of it digging into her tongue, the bitter sharp taste of metal and blood galvanizing her determination. She had to get out. Her stomach growled, hunger gnawing at her. They'd taken her pack when they put her in here, and she had to get it back before she left. Had to eat, had to find a place to hold up, and drink to forget this. Sarah eyed it longingly, shaken from her yearning when the cage bars rattled. Oak stood there, a bowl of soup proffered through the bars. "Here, it'll keep you until morning, and then we'll convene and decide your fate. Don't worry, no one has turned away. All this," he gestured to the cage, "it's just scare tactics. Gets you in the right headspace for survival. You are safe here, and hey, you get to sleep without fear of the earth swallowing you up." He smiled then, and put the bowl on the floor when she didn't accept it.
If I wasn't in the right headspace to survive, I wouldn't have made it this far. But thank you for the food and the place to rest.
She looked him in the eyes then.
Do you really think this is the best way?
She asked, not even sure herself whether she was talking about the cage or their plans for the earth. "We've tried it other ways. This works best." He nodded and walked away, leaving her to the food and rest, or at least to the food. She wouldn't rest, wouldn't feel calm until she was free from this cage, this camp. It was full dark and the moon hung fat and low in the sky. The fire had died down, the grounded were sleeping. They were so secure that their way was the best. They hadn't even posted a guard on her cage. At least something was going her way. She had ground the wire against stone, sharpening it, and now she sliced through the ropes which held her cage closed. The door creaked open, but no one stirred, and she snuck out of the cage and across to her bag, gripping the sharpened wire in her hand. She slipped the pack over her shoulder, took one last look around the village and turned away. "Hey!" someone called. Sarah burst into a run, not turning to look. Other shouts joined in, and the sound of shoes slapping against concrete filled her ears. She plunged into the forest, branches scraping against her face and arms. She stumbled over a fallen tree and clawed at the ground for purchase, forcing herself upright, and on and on and on. Everything was a blur of motion. Greens and browns swarmed her vision until she burst forth into a clearing. She teetered on the edge, too scared to step into the open, too scared to turn back. She turned left and pushed back a little, hit a line of trunks too solid to make it through, and there she found a crack in one, big enough for her. She threw her pack in first and then slid between the rough edges of the tree and into the space between. All sound disappeared. She was cocooned so completely that it was like entering another world, one in which the grounded didn't exist, one in which she barely existed. Sarah inhaled the scent, musky and wooden, that sweet, not sickly smell of softening fibres and earth. As she sank to the ground, her hands scrubbing aside fallen leaves and sticks and finding the earth below.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry we were such useless inhabitants. I'm sorry that even now there are those seeking dominion over you. They should know better. They should have learned.
The leaves whispered in response, and the earth warmed against her fingertips. She reached into her backpack and pulled out the bottle of vodka she'd been saving, thinking perhaps she could trade it for something along the way. But now that they were probably looking for her and she was here inside a tree, probably the perfect place to be swallowed whole, she needed a drink. Needed not to feel it when the ground smothered her and dragged her under. Sarah uncapped the bottle and knocked it back, slurping greedily. It wasn't her favourite drink. Hell, not even on her top 5, but desperate times. She took another pull. The liquid spilled out of her mouth, dribbled down her chin as she closed her eyes and leaned back against the wood.
This is the life. A life.
She took a third drink before capping the bottle and digging around in her pack. She found some old beef jerky and a bottle of unlabelled pills. Like the alcohol, it didn't really matter what they were for. She shook a few onto her palm and chased them down with more vodka before slowly chewing the jerky. What came next? She didn't really want to contemplate it. She'd ruled out becoming one of the grounded, and maybe the tangata whenua would be more of the same. Crazies, thinking the world owed them something. She was better alone. Her nose tingled and she squeezed it, not wanting to let loose the tears it warned of, but there was no stopping them. They ran down her face in thick streams, dripped off her chin and soaked into her jersey, making her shiver in the night air. She closed her eyes and leaned her head back, letting the alcohol and pills settle into her system. The earth seemed to shift now and then, but she knew it wasn't the bad kind, just the drug. She swallowed a few more, hoping that maybe the combination would put her to sleep forever. And then the earth really was moving, rumbling beneath her, the dirt shaking loose, swallowing her feet and binding her to the ground. Sarah dropped the bottle and it was swallowed too as she clawed at the walls of the tree, trying to find purchase. No, she didn't want to die, not like this. She couldn't breathe as the dust filled her lungs and she screamed, not caring who heard her.
No, please, no!
The rumble of earth stopped. Only the sway and creak of trees filling the air. It was like Papatuanuku had paused, for her.
You wish to live, child?
Sarah couldn't be sure it was the goddess, but then, what could she be sure of these days? They weren't spoken words, weren't heard, but there, all the same.
I don't want to die,
she whispered back.
Not wanting to die and wanting to live are not opposites. Do you wish to live?
Yes.
she said, more firmly this time, her word giving her clarity, or as much as she could have in this drug-fuddled haze.
You are not like those others. You do not wish to own me.
It's not my right. No one can own you. If we'd just been better. Maybe if we'd just been better, none of this would have happened.
Do you wish to be tangata whenua?
Sarah's head snapped up, though there was no one to look at, no eyes to act as mirrors of the Earth's soul.
Yes. Yes, I do. But at what cost does it come?
At least she had learned something from her time with the Grounded.
Destroy them, then return to me, and I will protect you until the world is reborn.
You mean kill the Grounded? But they can't pose a real threat to you, surely.
As long as such as those roam the earth, I can never truly be safe. Choose wisely.
The ground released, retreated, leaving her shaking and wishing that she had some stronger drugs. Sarah spent the next days prowling the land, gathering tools and weapons and explosives, or anything that could be used as such. It was a strange thing to move with confidence, to know that the earth wasn't going to take her at any instant. The fact that she wouldn't be dead, but awaiting rebirth, gave her all the solace she needed. Each night she would retreat to the tree, warmth rising from the ground below, and some gift of the land waiting for her to consume to keep her strong. But now it was time to take her tools and lay waste to the camp. Time to take a life. She sipped from her vodka bottle, the supply almost gone, and wondered what would it feel like to actively kill someone when she had spent years healing others as a doctor. These people would have happily taken her eye or leg or nose and would have raped her the same way they raped the land. So it was fair, it was right, and just, and she would do it. She just couldn't promise that she'd do it well, or do it right, or survive the night. And it didn't matter. None of it mattered. She would do this thing because she knew it was her only hope, and hope was a precious thing. Even hope coupled with despair and violence and blood. The moon was waning now, less full and round and fat, and she felt a little more secure because of the new shadows it created. It was fitting that the moon would be devoured by the sky, that she would be devoured by the earth. Her pack was full of petrol and lighters and ropes. She had strapped knives to her thighs, covered her face with soot, and held a gun. She'd never fired one before, and probably couldn't hit anyone with it, but it looked good, it felt good, heavy in her hands, full of menace. And maybe it was the thing that did the killing, and not her. Maybe after, she could bury all this, burn it to the ground, and forget it was a thing she'd been part of. Or maybe not. The dirt was smooth and flat, stretching out before her. The trees seemed to bow out of her way as she passed, and her footprints disappeared back into the ground as she moved. All the alcohol had burned from her system, but the leaves seemed to whisper at her, and for the first time in days she saw birds of all colours and sizes lining her way, calling to her even now in the night. The stars seemed to swim in the sky, and then she was there, on the border of the forest, the concrete street lying before her. This was it, her moment, and yet she couldn't move. It was as though the concrete had cemented her to the spot. The gun in her hand twitched as she considered her options. The birds had fallen silent, and now it was all up to her. She took the first step, gathering her anger, her sorrow, using it to focus her mind on the task at hand. She would not think of the bodies or the spilled blood. She wouldn't think of the lives lost, rather of the lives saved, her life, Papatuanuku, other tangata whenua. It was a simple enough thing to sneak around the edge of the town, setting small fires in buildings as she went. These were all empty, as if even the grounded were still not certain of their safety, didn't want to tempt the earth into coming for them, Soft snores alerted her to a presence when she entered a house, one in from the edge of town. He lay on the couch, his arm flung out, fingers scraping the floor, feet dangling over the end. She thought about screaming, thought the sound might wake him, make him attack his intruder. Thought that maybe she would feel better if this was self-defense, but it wasn't. Sarah tucked her gun into her belt and stepped lightly toward the man. There were spatters of grey around his temples and through his beard, and he had a kind-looking face, at least in repose. His other hand was tucked under his chin, and it was missing all the fingers. She drew her knife, held her breath, and slashed it across his throat. Blood splashed over his fingerless hands, and his eyes, deep blue, shot open as he screamed. She shoved her palm against his mouth, shook her head as her whole body trembled. His hands reached for her arm, too weak to push her away. The wound in his neck gaped, air spluttering through it as he tried to draw breath, tried to speak. And then he was dead, and she was dripping. She rubbed her fingers together, trying to get the sticky, warm liquid from them. Brushed them frantically on her pants, but a part of him had leaked into her now, and she couldn't get clean. There were sounds outside now, sounds of people. How many would come? She grabbed her knife tighter, wiped the blade clean on her pants, and looked for the back door, threw a stick of dynamite as she did. No waiting, watching for the sound of the explosion behind her, keeping her eyes ahead, her ears attuned. The first was the hardest. The first was always the hardest. She told herself that over and over again as she rushed into houses, burning things, threw more sticks of dynamite. No one would be sleeping now, not after the whoomph of the house being demolished. She'd set a trail of fire behind her, and it was only a matter of time now before they came, before they overtook her. There was a commotion ahead, so she switched tact, heading for the middle of their camp, for the bonfire that always burned.
Hey! Help me!
Came a cry from the cage. Sarah crossed to it, slicing through the rope with ease, but pausing.
Do you wish to conquer the world? See it enslaved to mankind?
She looked the other woman in the eyes, watched them waver, liquid and limpid in the firelight.
Answer me!
I want to survive.
Surviving isn't enough. Not now. But run, and maybe you will.
Sarah cut the wire and moved on. The other cages were empty, but footfalls filled the air, and she turned to the fire, the grounded seeming to swell from the flames, the heat distorting their faces. You came back? Called Oak. Sarah nodded.
But not to become one of you.
He tilted his head to the side, a smug look on his face. Are you sure about that?
Damn sure.
She didn't wait for the ambush, didn't care to see who was behind her, or whether there were guns trained on her. She removed her pack and flung it into the fire, then dove behind the cage and hoped it would be enough. The explosion rocked the ground, lit the sky so bright that afterwards she couldn't see, but she could hear them groaning, hear screams, hear their fear echoing in the air. Sarah pushed herself to her knees, crawled away from the noise. Her ribs ached and breath was hard to come by, but it didn't matter. She had done what was needed. Morning light filtered through the leaves as she neared the tree. Everything hurt. Her mouth was parched, her body bruised inside and out. Blood still covered her hands and she could smell it. Was sure she would, no matter how well she cleaned herself. Finally, she collapsed on the ground, in the cocoon of the trunk. The warm air folded around her and she closed her eyes and waited.
Rest, child. You have done enough.
I killed a man. I killed many.
Sarah coughed, tried not to cry. She dragged another breath in, let it slip from her body.
You killed for a worthy cause, and now you can sleep. Sleep in my flesh, and I will wake you when it's time.
The ground moved, but this time it didn't scare her. It was warm and soft like flesh, wrapping her in an earthen embrace. She didn't even struggle as it sucked her down into a pocket of earth. She knew knew that she would be reborn into a new world, a better world.
Thanks for listening to Emerging Aotearoa. Stick around after the credits for Hope Lies North, the song written, performed and produced by Heretic for this episode.
Samuel Barrable,
aka Heretic, is a musician from the small town of Ngātea. Heretic has been recording and mixing his own music as a way to provide a form of escapism for himself and his listeners, with themes that are generally centered around high fantasy and Lovecraftian horror. Heretic provides a portal to unearthly realms, centered within the mind through lengthy instrumentals constructed from heavy bass lines and sweeping atmospheric guitar melodies. You can find more of Heretic's music on Spotify by searching Heretic Free of Flesh or going to heretic666.bandcamp.com. Hope Lies North was written by
J.C. Hart.
You can find more at justcassie.com. Narration, Oak, and additional voices by
Sam.
Sarah by
Julie Barr.
Papatuanuku by
Raupunawaiariki Griffiths.
Woman in a Cage by me, Knicki Blake. Emerging Aotearoa is a collaborative Creatives Aotearoa production. All work is licensed under a Creative Commons International Non-Derivative 4.0 Share-alike license. Please share it, but don't modify or sell it. Celebrating diversity, creativity, and collaboration, we hope to create a new resource for emerging artists and diverse voices to have their art experienced. If you would like to collaborate with us or submit your poetry, short stories, or music, please contact us by emailing emergingaotearoa@gmail.com or by sending us a message through our Facebook page, Emerging Aotearoa, or Instagram, Emerging Aotearoa Pod. We are now taking submissions for Season 2, launching Autumn 2022, the theme being Perspectives. Now for the shameless self-promotion. We'd love to have your feedback. Letting us know what you thought of our show by leaving a review on it on your platform of choice or through Facebook helps other people know what to expect and lets us build a better show for you. And please, if you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing it with your friends to help get the word out. While we're starting out, this is truly the greatest support you could show. Next week will be our Collaborators Roundtable episode, where the people involved in the making of this episode and the last chat about the ideas behind the art, their creative processes and experiences. We welcome questions from listeners, so please let us know if you have any. Now to see us out, Hope Lies North from Heretic.